Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm Ewan Johnston, one of the SAC consultants based at Thainston in Aberdeenshire. Tonight's webinar is Planning to Grow Cereals in 2022. We have 3 speakers for you tonight. We have Steve Hoad, David Ross, and Neil Havis. Steve Hoad, as many of you will know, works for SRUC in the variety selection, as is one of the panelists on the Scottish recommended list. David Ross is Business Development Manager at Stonehaven, covering the Northeast. And Neil Havis is a plant pathologist based at SRUC in Edinburgh. So we'll have 3 20-minute talks each, and we can then have time for questions at the end. But please do feel free to type in any questions as when you've got them, and we can field them as we can as the meeting progresses. So I'll not delay any further. If I can ask Steve for you to share your screen.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. I'll just bring this up. There. Is that okay, everyone?
Yeah, well, I can definitely see it, so that looks good.
Yeah. Okay, thanks then, Ewan, and good evening, everyone. It's good to see such a good number this evening. So what we'll do is give you a chance to have a look at some of the highlights from the new Scottish cereals list. So this is the first opportunity we've had to show this to an external audience. So the full list is going to be launched in the next few days. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just highlight what we'll go through. So you're probably aware that the AHGBs recommended list was launched last week, and we aim to launch the Scottish list by next Monday. Okay. Now, just as a view on changes, spring barley, the list is relatively short because we've had no new entries this year. We've dropped a couple of varieties off the list, and what I'll do is I'll give you the highlights and a couple of varieties that we need to look out for this year, as they've been on the list now. This is their 3rd year, but they're still relatively new, and I want to put them in the right position for you for this coming season and beyond. So spring oats, that short list, we've had 1 variety out and 1 in. Spring wheat, well, it's the longest list we've had for a few years. So there's 2 varieties added there. Winter barley, yes, we've dropped 3 and brought in 4. And winter wheat, quite a few changes here. We've removed 4 varieties, but added 6. So I'll show you those changes at the end of the presentation. So if we start with spring barley first of all, and if we look at the current market leaders for the malting sector, so these will be the familiar varieties to us all. Okay, so we've got laureates, which last harvest intake was more than half of the UK malting crop. So in Scotland, that was getting up to about 2/3 of the Scottish intake was in laureates. So that's been supported by LG Diablo and KWS SAC. So both Laureate and Diablo suit that brewing and distilling use, and Diablo's future development could well depend on how the Scottish and English markets support that brewing as well as distilling use in Scotland. Okay, and SASI retains a decent market share in Scotland, and faring with the special or the specific recommendation is the only fully recommended variety for grain distilling. Okay, so where I've got the market column there, those are all malting barley committee approvals. Okay, so all full approvals. You'll see there in terms of yield, the successive Laureate from the last harvest actually upped its yield on average. So Laureate and Diablo kind of side by side when it comes to treated yield now. Two varieties that I want to dwell on for a few moments are SY Tungsten and Firefox. So these two, they've been on the list now. This is their third year. And the AHGBs recommended list, you'll see that they've got a full recommendation. Now, what we've done for the Scottish list, we've considered them as P3 or provisional 3 in terms of its position on the list, because we're still waiting for, hopefully, for full approval from the Malting Barley Committee for their different end uses. So SY Tungsten, hopefully it will get brewing and distilling approval, and Firefox is distilling only. And it takes, after 3 years of micro malting tests, where we can get to a stage of provisional approval from the MBC, we then go through a year or two of what we call macro scale tests. So both varieties need to complete some more macro scale tests to get that full MBC approval. So fingers crossed that both make it onto the list with that position, because certainly in terms of distilling, there's not anything that's immediately behind these varieties. Okay. So what you can see in terms of yield, there's a small improvement over Laureate and LG Diablo. So we just focus a little bit more on these two. So SY Tungsten, it's got Malting Barley Committee provisional approval 2, brewing and distilling. Untreated yield loss at 13%. Yeah, I suppose it's relatively high, but it's got an outstanding treated yield. So we expect that loss to be a little bit higher than an average. Specific weight is pretty good. Screening's not bad, and maturity is okay. Bit of an issue there on Rinco. Neil Havis will probably say something about that in his presentation. So just watch out for that. Quality-wise, through the microscale tests, tungsten was very good, both in terms of its malt extract and its spirit yield. And it's characterized by low grain nitrogen and a good grain size. Skinning wise, we're regarded as being intermediate. So it's kind of around about the concerto level, but not as bad as Propino. So if we go on to Firefox, so similar stage of development, then distilling only, so hopefully it gets its macro scale tests. Screenings, not bad, fairly low. Specific weight, a little bit below average, but notice maturity is relatively early. So a plus point there, Rincosporium better resistance than tungsten. So this has got good extract, spirit yield, bold grain, low grain nitrogen, and note the final point there. It's shown through the evaluation coming through the malting system that it's had relatively low levels of grain skinning. So I think that's something that looks quite encouraging in terms of a new variety. So just on the other choices then, just to towards completing the spring barley list, we've got 3 brewing only varieties that we've retained on the Scottish list. So Skyway, Splendor and Planet. Planet, although it's lower yielding now than most of the other newer varieties, it's an incredibly good sort of stable all-round variety. So for brewing or feed use. Prospect is an out-and-out feed variety, but you'll note that both SY Splendor and Prospect, we're keeping at that sort of provisional 3 in terms of the list, because we just get a bit more of a market steer before they go to R, possibly next year. Yeah, so actually that's, yes, straight on to spring oats now then. Yeah, so that's really quite a short list. So we've lost Sienna, we've lost Cosmopolitan, and as I say, there's no new distilling varieties that's come onto the list, although AHGB do have some brewing varieties that have gone onto their larger list. So on to spring oats. This is the complete list for this coming season. So you see a range of yields there. Merlin, one of the new varieties, so new this year onto the list at P1, relatively high yielding, and it matches yield comparable to the high quality Isabel. You can see a range in the treated year with Conway and Eliane at relatively low yielding. Eliane, to some extent, we would regard as becoming outclassed. The market leaders in terms of seed and area have been Canyon and Conway, but it'd certainly be nice to see that quality of Isabel sort of tested and taken up a bit more. I think we'd quite like to see that really nice combination of yield and quality being more utilised. On spring wheats, as I alluded to before, the list is relatively long now. So we've got the standard well-established varieties like Malika, sort of high quality milling wheats relatively early. That's now joined by another high quality milling wheat, KWS Lardum. So again, like Malika, relatively early maturity. Then across Nabim Group 2, we've got a couple of varieties, and then we got 4 feed varieties. So you can see it's quite a variation in yield there, and I've just flagged up some of the maturity differences as well. But do look at the full agronomics when the Scottish list comes out, or go onto the AHGB list, because there's certainly plenty of choice in terms of yield and agronomic features for this crop. So what I'll do now, we're just the final slides. I'll just go through changes, one slide on winter barley and one slide on winter wheat. And we'll go through these changes a lot more at the road shows in January, and also during the field season next spring and summer. But just wanted to flag up what we've done on the winter barley list. We've removed 3 varieties. I've neglected to include Belmont here. So we've moved KWS Tower, KWS Hawking, and Belmont, one of the 6-row hybrids. So they've come off, and then we've added 4 new varieties. So LG, Dazzle, and Lightning. These are both 2-row feed varieties, look very competitive in terms of yield, so they will compete well with the yield of a variety like Mountain. Both have got pretty good specific weights and good untreated yield. So I think they certainly merit their position in that quite competitive 2-row feed category now. KWS Ferris, this is a 6-row. It originally came through the system as a 6-row malting candidate, but it didn't make the spec for that sector. It had some issues in modification during the malting process. but it still looks valuable as a variety that's got a tolerance to BY-DV. So that looks useful. It's a bit lower yielding than funky, but that tolerance looks useful. Note my spelling mistake there. It's BY-DV. The last one is SY Canyon. So this is a new 6-row hybrid that complements the 4 or 5 others on the Scottish list. Very, very good specific weights, actually. I note that with Canyon, yeah, it's just over 71, which is quite outstanding for a 6-row and a hybrid. And just to complete the winter series here, so here's quite a lot of information on here. So winter wheat changes, Revelation, LG Sundance, LG Prince, and LG Quasar have all come off the list. Prince and Quasar, we only had them on the list for a year, and you might recall that we had Astronomer and Illuminate also joining those two last year in the biscuit making category. So we've kept Astronomer and Illuminate, but we don't see a position for Prince or Quasar. Likewise, Revelation, Sundance, their use has been relatively small and seed rate relatively low. So on to the positive news about other choices for wheat for next autumn. In the soft wheats category for feed and for distilling, we've got RGT Stokes and RGT Bairstow. These look quite exciting distilling varieties. They're both rated good by the SWRI. They've both got good treated yield, and compared to most varieties, their untreated yield is good as well. So that's sort of quite an exciting development there of quality for distilling, but also quality in terms of some of the agronomic features. We also include Bream, KWS Bream. So this is a new biscuit and distilling variety. There were 2 other biscuit and distilling varieties, but we've chosen this one as the best of the bunch. So this is rated medium for distilling and has that dual purpose use in the same way that varieties like Illicit does and Illuminate and Astronomer that I just mentioned. This year was a first time for a while that we've added 3 hard textured wheats in the same year. So we've done this because we think that hard wheats, the out and out feed varieties like KWS Dorsum and LG Typhoon can add value within the crop rotation because of particular agronomic features they have to support sort of high yield. So we've added these 2 to support varieties like Gleam and Inciter. And certainly compared to the older feed wheats like Gleam, the untreated yield of these 2 is much better. So we're quite excited about those as hard feed options. And if they do well this year, then they could well replace varieties like Gleam and Inciter. And the final one is actually a group 2. So we don't often have group 1s or 2s these days, but this variety, as I've just said for Dorsum and Typhoon, it's got a very good untreated yield. So we think that could add some value to the list. And I know that some of our growers, they do like a wheat that's relatively early maturing. So this is -1. So group 2 quality, good untreated yield, and an early maturity. So we felt that had value for the list. So that really was kind of a whiz through the changes. So I hope that's useful, certainly for the spring choices, making decisions there, and then things to look out for when we come into the workshops and the open days into next year. So I'll just leave you with this kind of final slide of some of the things we quite like to do with the Scottish list. It's really about adding value, getting more from trials data, but perhaps begin to integrate much more with commercial farm data. So we can really get down to the idea of varieties that have got performance realized on farm compared to trials, and also then commercially downstream in processing. So we want to follow varieties all the way through, make that link between testing and and performance on farm. And increasingly, I think we are going to be seeing the addition of added value in terms of indicators of stability, quality performance, and performance on farm. Okay, so thanks very much, and please come back to me at SRUC if you want more information, and look out for the launch of the list. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. I don't know, do you know what date it is being launched, the recommended list?
Aiming to, after review, aiming to get this out next Monday.
All right. Oh, well, so everyone that's listening, watch out for it then. Just as a wee reminder, if there's any questions that have been brought up as regards Steve, if you just write it into the question and answer bit at the bottom of your screen, and we can get questions coming, and we can try and get, while you've got them fresh in your mind, and we can get some of them answered later on, the question and answer session later on.
Yeah. Good.
Right. Next up is David Ross on what has become a very hot topic of the minute, with fertilizer prices being as high as they are. So, David, are you ready?
Thanks, Ewan.
Okay.
Hopefully everybody can see that.
Yep, that looks fine.
Right, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. There's a good turnout and what's a fairly topical subject. I'm going to have a bit of a whiz round some of the things to be thinking about for this coming season, and have a little kind of pull together some of the things that we think you should be looking at, like I say, for this next season. So just to make a start, let's look at current fertilizer price. It depends which day of the week it is and who you speak to, but I've got a little bit of data here which came for the AHGB, so you can see the kind of the changes that there is in fertilizer price. So this is from October 21, September 21. You'll see the two prices there, the changes for the previous month, what it was this time or October last year, and then the change for the previous year. So you can see all the inputs are at least 100% over what they were last year. And I had a little bit of a phone round today, and I'm getting ammonium nitrate that's about 630, triple super phosphate about the 535 mark, and muriate of potash at about 550 or thereabouts. So it's shifted again, a little bit of a kind of moving feast at the moment. So why the increase? You've probably read a lot of this in the press, but I just thought it was good to kind of cover it. So we've got an increased global demand for fertilizer. At the moment, we've got protectionist policies in China and Russia, which is reducing or banning trade, where quite a lot of the world's fertilizer is being made. We've got significant energy costs, especially gas, which is used in the nitrogen production. We've got geopolitical policies, which is basically the Russians having a little bit of a squabble with the rest of Europe and turning the gas pipe off for a little while, but causing a bit of trouble as far as prices is concerned in Europe and in Britain. The UK is globally quite a small market as well, so we don't use a huge amount of fertiliser compared to some other countries. So getting our share into the country is it can be quite tricky. And Brexit, dare I say it, is making trade and import a little bit more challenging. So if you can do trade with the rest of Europe and it's pretty easy going, or you try and put stuff into the UK and it becomes problematic, that is going to have a cost impact on what we're doing as well. But on the back of that, current market prices for our produce is doing quite well. This is taken for the AHGB. You can see the prices for wheat, for feed barley as well, all looking quite strong at the moment. And if we look at futures prices, which this was taken just the tail end of last week, see strong prices in the market through into next year as well. So it is helping that output prices is on the up, but we've got to think of the cost that has to us on the inputs. So if we just have a little think about fertiliser requirements, just a plea for a start is really to think about getting the basics right. We have got, there is always something that is going to limit yield in your crop, whether that is a nutrient from nitrogen, calcium, could be pH. In many years it is daylight or rain or that affects it. And we just need to be careful that the nutrients input that we put into the crop is only part of the picture, and we need to think about that. So my kind of thing for the basics is think about getting soils analysed regularly, make sure you've got your pH correct, get your phosphate analysed, remember, and use modified Morgans if you're getting soils analysed, because that is the analysis that is best suited to Scottish soils. So Scottish soils are generally more acidic in their nature compared to English soils. So using modified Morgans, you will get the most accurate phosphate availability to the crop. We find that those used in an English soil analysis, you will find them to be higher than what they actually are. And obviously get your potash analysed as well. Correct your pH first, so always get that first. That's the first thing to sort. You've got to remember that when you analyse your soils, that is looking at the availability of that nutrient at that pH. So if you manipulate the pH, the nutrient will become more available. So always correct pH first before you go in and correct a low status for P and K. Remember and think this, the kind of basics: drainage, structure, soil health, trying to get soils in as good condition as possible. All of these helps with nutrient cycling and helps knock one of these things off of the Liebig's barrel there, trying to make sure that they are in optimum condition. So just remember about that as well. And the other thing I would say is remember and keep sulfur levels up. So cereals, spring oilseed rape and grass, you're looking for 40 kilos of SO3 put onto them. And in winter oilseed rape, you're looking for 75 kilos. So sulfur is really important in the nitrogen cycle and in the way nitrogen is cycled through the plant, and it lets it's there in the formation of proteins within the plant, and so it's really important that you've got a good supply of sulfur in what you're applying your fertilizer, and it helps with nitrogen use efficiency, which I'll speak a little bit about later on. So pH, many of you have seen this before, but we would always recommend to have your pH within the range 5.8 to 6.2. If you're using a traditional way of soil sampling, then you want to be liming to 6.2 to be able to reduce that variability, because there will be variability within a field. If you're using GPS sampling, then there is the potential to drop that target pH down a little bit, because the variability, you're getting rid of the variability. And what I'm finding with some of the guys that we have GPS sampled for a number of years is that although we've been targeting a pH of 6.2, actually the pH is rising up above that, and we would like to keep it in that band. So most of the nutrients are available at that. You might ask a little bit about phosphorus at that pH, but in Scottish soils, because they're inherently a bit more acidic, it tends to be that that phosphorus is available at a slightly lower pH, or is more available at a slightly lower pH. So it's trying to get the best bang for your buck. It's trying to manipulate the pH to the point that you get the best value from it without lumping on a lot of lime, which is getting increasingly expensive. But by doing that, you do get better availability of the nutrients that you've got. So a really important thing to think about. So if we start thinking about nutrient requirement, the removal is in the top box. So we've got grain only. If you're just removing grain and chopping straw, and then we've got grain and straw. So they're 7 kilos a P and 10.5 a K. So if we just go through the calculations, this is for a crop of wheat, a 10-ton crop of wheat, 10 ton per hectare. And the soil status here, I've said is moderate in both cases. But if it was low or very low status here, this is how you could correct this. It's maybe worth thinking about how you correct it this year, because if it's going to come from an inorganic source out the bag, it's going to be pretty expensive to try and correct it. So maybe by getting fields analysed, and if you've got a source of FYM or slurry in the system, you've got the option to target those fields that are low to pull up P and K values. So think about that. So for this 10-ton crop of wheat, the removal by the crop for grain and straw, we're looking for 70 kilos a P and 105 a K. So the total required in this instance is 70 and 105. And if we think about organic manures, you'll see the different values we've got here. There's a technical note on it, which is numbered up at the top there. And you see that these organic manures have significant amounts of N, P and K and sulfur in their composition, and are really useful in trying to boost soil reserves. And you'll see down the right hand side, I've put together some of the values of what they're worth at the moment with today's values. So yeah, really useful if you've got a source of hen pen or layer manure. Really quite powerful stuff, really good source of sulfur as well. Just got to be a little bit careful when you apply it and how you apply it, because it does tend to be a little bit of rocket fuel. So just being able to manage that properly. Another thing I would say is just look at the different organic manures, and they are variable. The muck that you produce, these are standard figures, but the stuff you produce in your own farm, if it's intensive diets that you're feeding, will see quite high levels of N, P and K in them, and it is variable. It's variable between sort of, if you're feeding intensive bulls or something versus dry cows, you will see a difference in the muck that comes out from them. So just be mindful of that when you're taking that into consideration. If we look at winter wheat, so our total required was 70 and 105 from a previous slide. If you put on 25 tonne to hectare a winter applied muck, it's producing 15 of available N to the crop, 15 kilos, and we've assumed it's 100% of the P and 100% of the K that's available to the following crop. So you can see that the balance in this case you're putting on, or you're applying 10 kilos more of P and 95 kilos more of K by applying that at the FYM in this instance. And if you're not doing that, to come for the bag, you need to apply 350 kilos of 0, 20, 30 or equivalent to do the equivalent. So if we look at spring barley, again at the top I've got the grain only removals in this grain and straw. So for grain and straw, it's 8.5 and 12 kilos in this instance. So if we look at a 7.5 ton crop, again, I've left the soil status as moderate. We're looking for a removal of the crop, 64 kilos a P and 90 a K. So that's a requirement for that crop. If we were to look at again that muck applied, we've got enough. We've got a plus balance of 16 kilos and 110, a big excess of K with that amount of FYM being applied. Just a little caveat on this one, that we would always recommend a little bit of phosphate goes down the spout for spring crops in the spring. Just helps to get that crop growing. Phosphate doesn't move very much in the soil, and if it is cold, just having a little bit of available P there makes a huge difference. So even though it's maybe not required in here by the FYM applied, it is better just to have that in there just to get it going. And here again, the 370 kilos of 14, 14, 21 would be the equivalent, and you would still be a little bit short in P and K in that calculation. And that is, it here says 10, but it is in a 7.5 ton crop, a spring barley. So what would be looking to get? So nitrogen, the break-even ratio is the next thing that I wanted to sort of cover. There's a technical note on this in technical C and technical note 731, and it's based on a break-even ratio of 3:1, i.e. 3 kilos of grain needed to pay for each 1 kilo of nitrogen, and it works on oilseed rape as a ratio of 2.5 to 1. So I'm just going to run through how to calculate that for yourself. And then some of the considerations when you're thinking about break-even ratio for nitrogen. So when you're working it out, it's a kilo of grain needed to pay for 1 kilo of N. It's calculated it like this. So you take the price per ton of fertilizer times 100 and divide it by the percent N in the fertilizer times 10, which gives you the pence per kilo of nitrogen. And then you do the same, you take the price per ton of grain, divide that by 10, and that gives you the pence per kilo of grain or seed. And the break-even ratio is just 1 over the other. So I've got a little calculation as an example. So ammonium nitrate is at the moment 630. So 630 divided by 34.5, which is the percentage of nitrogen, times 10 makes it £1.83 a kilo. Feed wheat, we could argue what price it's going to be, but I've said 210. It means it's worth 21 pence a kilo. So the break-even ratio here, or the ratio between these two, is 8.7 to 1. Okay. So once you've calculated that, you need to think where that fits into the system. So this is the amount of nitrogen to reduce by. So in winter cereals and oilseed rape, for every whole point, you would say in break-even ratio, it equates to 11 kilos of nitrogen. And in spring cereals and spring oilseed rape, it's 8 kilos. So if you're at 8.7, you're over 7.5. So we're looking at a reduction of something like 55 kilos for winter cereals, and something like 40 kilos for spring crops. Now that's all well and good. It gives us a base to start thinking about. But I think you really need to think about where you are about the nitrogen response curve and where you are on that curve at the moment. So if we think, this is some trials work from Ian Bingham for winter wheat for 2021. The dots are the different yields and the line is the line of best fit. And if you look at 220 kilos on this line, on this graph, versus so 220 would be standard standard end rate without any manipulation for yield on NVZ guide. If you think of that versus a 180, so 40 kilos back, you'll see that the difference in that bit, the difference in the curve is actually is very shallow. So the yield difference for that reduction in nitrogen is not huge. So if you're at 220, you could come back by 40 kilos to 180 and it would not have a huge amount of difference on yield. Now, if you then are at 180 at the moment, so you're on the middle line, and you come back, I said 50 kilos here, but you come back to 130, then this drop is obviously getting a bit bigger. So you need to think about where you are on this line at the moment and roughly where your yields are when you consider how much you're going to change this. And if we look at spring barley, the spring barley curve, again, this is for East Lothian site in spring barley for 2021. The line is a lot steeper. So again, you need to think about where you are on this line. So if you're at 130 kilos and you come back 40 kilos, that is the sort of yield reduction that there potentially will be. But if you're at 100, if you're at 100 at the moment, then obviously you need to think about how far you want to shift that. So worth having a look. Need to think about where you're at on that curve at the moment, how far you're pushing it, and whether when the response curve is, especially in wheat, when the response curve is that flat, whether it is pushing for that extra bit of yield. Sort of following on from that, what we've done is, if you look at winter wheat at 210 pounds and nitrogen at 183 a kilo, which is at 630 a ton, if we say that at 220 kilos, the yield is 10.25. This table shows how much you could cut the nitrogen rate by and still be better off. So if we take up first line at 200 kilos, the yield goes down to 10.15. So there's a 0.1 reduction in yield. That's worth £21, but the saving in fertiliser from going from 220 to 200 is 36.60. So if you keep going with that analogy, if you keep going, you can down to 140, yield drops to 9.5. You've lost 0.75 a tonne. That's worth 157.50, but the fertiliser that you've saved is £160 a hectare. So at that point, that's why it's in green, you're actually better off. You maybe got slightly less yield, but you've spent less on fertiliser, therefore you're better off. For those beyond that point, so beyond the 140 kilos, you then start saving less in fertiliser than you have saved, than you have got from the crop. So it is, so at that point, it is not worth cutting down that far. So you need to have a little think about this. It's quite a good way to do it. there is some kind of standard data that we've used here, and that, like I say, that's on wheat. But it shows you that you can cut it back. The yield might be back a bit, but you'll have saved a fair bit on fertiliser. And as we know, a lot to do with the growing season as to what yield you get, not just the amount of nitrogen you throw on. So, okay. So end use things to remember. Every farm's break-even ratio for nitrogen will be different. Everybody's using slightly different types of fertiliser and different prices paid. Some folk will have bought early and might be okay. Some people have bought late and need and will have quite a high cost for their fertiliser, and there'll be a mixture in everything in between. So you need to really think about what it is for your farm for this season. Response curve is steeper in spring crops, so reduce end rate by less for each unit increase in break-even ratio compared to spring barley. Compared to wheat. So just be careful with that. And remember to take organic nitrogen into consideration. Fair amount of nitrogen there, which is useful to us. And nitrogen use efficiency. So trying to think about how the plant uses nitrogen and trying to make the most of the nitrogen that you are applying. I would say make sure you've got sulfur in with your nitrogen. Really important to get the efficiency up. And maybe applying smaller amounts more often to the crop would have a bigger advantage. There should be less waste depending on what the weather's like. Environmental benefits as well by putting small amounts on during the season and feeding the crop as it's growing rather than lumping on larger amounts less often. So just have a think about that. It's worthwhile looking at. And the last thing I really wanted to touch on was about margin. I mentioned it before. This is some data that's come from the AHGB Farm Bench. This is for 2020 harvest. It's not for 21 yet. And it just looks through the costs to grow a ton of wheat. So first column is the top 25%. Middle 50%, bottom 25%. So you'll see their cost of production varies fairly wildly from £125 to 208. A lot of that's to do with fixed costs. Organic nitrogen, the amount they're applying is not that different, but the yield that they're achieving at the end of the day is. Now, I've done a bit of a calculation, and it all depends on yields, but fertiliser now adds approximately, on that winter wheat crop, approximately £30 a tonne onto each of those, and it goes straight on. So the top 25 go to 155. The middle 50s at 176 and the bottom 25s at 238. Now, depending on what the market does, that means some of these guys will be making money and some of these guys will not be making money. So really important to get an idea of where your cost of production is and how this is going to affect you. And it might be it gives you an idea of where you can sell your grain. It gives you an idea of where you've got a margin and how you can maximize that margin. And if you looked at spring barley, I reckon it depends on yield again. So it's somewhere between £20 and £30 a tonne extra onto the cost of spring barley as well. So it really depends. Depends what yield you're at, but important to look at that as well. So my sort of take-home message is think about getting soils analysed regularly, either traditionally or through GPS. If you haven't done it a while, I would say it's definitely going to be worth doing this year. Correct pH before P and K, so sort that out. It'll make the nutrients, the other nutrients, more available to you, and make best use of them. Get your FYM and slurry analysed and take that into account. We've often counted these as a bit of a bonus, but with less resources in P and K coming along, it's definitely worth thinking about. Remember to keep your sulphur levels up. So 40 kilos for cereals, 75 kilos for oilseed rape. Keep them up, and it helps with it helps make best use of the nitrogen that you are applying. Work out your break-even ratio and reduce your end rates accordingly. Have a think about that and how you would fit that into your strategy for this coming year. And then calculate your cost of production. Join a farm bench benchmarking group if you've got the option for that. Log on to AHGBs farm bench site and start putting in some of your figures and have a look and see how you compare against others. And think net margin rather than output. You might have slightly less yield, but you'll still have a bit more pounds in your pocket, hopefully, at the end of the day. And if you've got any queries on the latest fertiliser stuff, if you go to fast.scot, you'll find all the technical notes in there. And if anybody's got any queries that didn't get answered today, feel free to email me, or you'll get me on Twitter as well. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, David. That was pretty comprehensive. A quick fly through. Hopefully there'll be a lot of questions come from that. Lots of food for thought. So that we can try and keep to time, we will quickly now nip on to Neil Havis, our last speaker for tonight, going through some of the take-home messages from some of the crop trials that have been happening this year. So take it away, Neil.
Okay, thank you, Ewan, and good evening, everybody, and thanks for staying on to the end. I hope you can all see that okay, if that goes to full screen. Okay, so as Ewan says, I'm going to give you a very brief kind of run through of some of the lessons from the 2021 field trials and a few things to think about when you're planning for 2022. Okay, so to make any sense of the trial results, we really have to examine the kind of growing season that we had. So obviously 2021, we said in 2020 a year like no other, when 2021 proved to be similar in certain respects, but different in others. One of the key things that we saw was that spring. Again, if you look at all the left-hand map, this is the spring 2021 compared to the 30-year average. Pretty white, so neither much colder or much warmer in terms of spring temperatures. But if you look on the map on the right-hand side, you can see in terms of the summer conditions we had, a lot of reds in there, so that was a warm summer for us. Just by comparison, if you look down into England, you can see they had a different summer from us completely, and you'll see more of that in the slides to come. So if anything, warmer than average. It was warmer than average, but that spring still had a few little kick in it. There was a few frosty mornings, a few winter barley crops suffered a bit under those late frosts. When you actually look at the mean temperatures, there's still quite a few blues in there in the spring. I can get that onto the screen. You can see that, yeah. So there's still a few blues in there. So you can see there are still a few cold mornings, and that checked some of the growth of the crops. So we ended up with quite uneven in terms of crop development. A lot of crops got to a certain growth stage and then stopped. Okay, so that had implications, as did some of the other conditions we had. And of course, the main driving factor for a lot of diseases is rainfall. So if you look on the map on the left, this is spring 2021. You can see there's a lot of, compared to the 30-year average, there's a lot of browns in there, a lot of white, but there's also some blues. So it's very variable. And that's something that we found from the whole growing season, very variable. So some people saying it's been really dry and warm and practically no diseases, where other other conditions, you can see the blues in there. There's a lot more than average rainfall, so they had a completely different picture. And likewise, you move across to the summer, and again, just what I was saying, look at those rainfall against the 30-year average. That's much drier in most of Scotland, apart from that area there. There's more whites and there's some blue, so that's above average rainfall. And compare that down to England and look at the rainfall down there. So they had a very different summer altogether. Okay. Okay, so what effect did that have on the disease? So in terms of the winter barley, I showed you we had a wet winter, then we had that dry, cool spring. That checked a lot of the splash-borne diseases, things like rhynchosporium. But if you did have rhynchosporium in there and you were in one of those pockets of a lot of rainfall, you needed a good T1, and that was important to check them, especially in the susceptible crops. We'll say a bit more about the spring barley later on. Said that those conditions were variable. It really depended on your locality. That's the picture on the right is a 6-row winter barley at our field trial site in Boghall. As you can see, the leaf is completely yellow, so that's extremely high disease pressure. Okay, so very variable. So a lot of splash-borne diseases were checked, but some of the pathogens which like a cool dry or even cool with some nighttime moisture, they had a field day, so to speak. So we had a lot of yellow rust at some of our sites. Okay, so in general, the disease came into barley crops, but if anything, it tended to come late. So the usual suspects, you know, rhynchosporium, we have brown rust in the middle there, we have powdery mildew at the bottom, and to the right, we have ramularia. So they all came into the crops, but the effect they actually had on yield and the severity of them all varied from area to area. Very much a mixed picture this year. But if you think about winter barley in total, and you look at some of the early estimates that came from Scottish Government, if anything, compared to 2020, that 8-week dry period of 2020 really checked the winter barley crops. It didn't favour yield at all. What we're seeing this year is a jump up compared to what we saw in previous years. So although the area was actually down, the first estimates for yield are up significantly on 2020, and we're back towards more 2019 levels. And if you compare that to the average, you can see that those are pretty good yields for winter barley crops. Okay. So one of the things we've been looking at is trying to develop an integrated pest management program in all of the barley crops. So in winter barley, we've been looking at 2 varieties. So LG Mountain, which is one of the high yielding 2-row feed, and Surge, which is a 2-row feed, but has a higher disease resistance. Steve touched on it in his talk. A lot of the new varieties that come onto the recommended lists are on there because they can hit that high yield target. But what we're not seeing coming through particularly strongly is varieties with good robust disease resistance. We'll say a bit more about that in spring barley, but in winter barley, we're not seeing 7s and 8s coming through on the recommended list, sadly. Okay, so these trials we're looking at, and we've been looking at the role of elicitors. So you probably heard me bang on about these before. Elicitors are simple compounds which actually activate the defense mechanisms in the host plant. And then following that, you can cut back on your fungicide use. So we've been looking at elicitors as the seed treatment. And then the thing about elicitors is you need to apply them early. So you're thinking T0 spray timing. So you might think about elicitor plus your herbicide. And then in terms of what you're putting on the crop, you can then cut your T1 and your T2 timings right the way back. So you can see in these programs, we're comparing completely untreated with untreated followed by Siltra and Comet and Revistar and Folpit, but these are a quarter rates, okay? So you're cutting your fungicide use right back. We're comparing that with what would probably be a more normal program. So that's half rate Siltra, half rate Comet, and then half rate Revistar and half rate Folpit. Okay, so we have them to compare. We have Laminarin as both a seed treatment and as a T0 spray. We have Laminarin as just a T0 spray, and we have Laminarin as just a seed treatment. Okay, so these are multiple trials we've been doing over a number of years, but I'm just going to show you the results from 2021. This is LG Mountain. The bars you see on the graph, The red bars is Rhynchosporium, and as you can see, it wasn't a high Rhynchosporium disease year. The green bars are green leaf area. We need to maintain green leaf area to get your yield. But of course, the line you're all interested in is this line here, and this is the yield. So there's that first group. So there's your untreated. So that gives you an estimate of what your untreated scores would be like. Around about just over 7.5 tons per hectare. Compare that with the first group you have there. That is your Laminarn as a seed treatment, and then that's quarter rate fungicide. And it's actually done better than the half rate fungicide. Okay. Again, the next three, there's your untreated. There, of course, it's 2 shots of Laminarn, and against the full rate, it hasn't done as well. The next set, this is untreated. There's the Laminarn as a T0 spray on its own, and as a T0 spray with reduced rate, it's actually done better than the full rate. Okay, and the last set, untreated, there's the Laminarn as a seed treatment on its own, and that's with a reduced quarter rate, and that's with a half rate. So you can see there's very little difference between them, apart from in this one of halving your fungicide costs. So if you're using the elicitor, you can cut your fungicide costs right back. Okay, so that was in mountain. We wanted to look at some quality aspects as well. So that's specific weight and 1,000 grain weight. The blue bar is specific weight. The orange bar is 1,000 grain weight. So if you look at them compared to the yield, you're seeing practically no significant difference between all of the different treatments. Okay. The 1,000 grain weight slightly increased in some, but it's not hugely different from the untreated. Okay, so those are the results with mountain. What about with surge? What about something where you have a bit more inherent genetic resistance? Okay, so you can see there's the untreated, there's Rhynchosporium, there's the same yields, there's that similar pattern to what we saw before. Okay, so in a lot of cases you can see Laminarn either as one application with the quarter rate fungicides is doing better than the Laminarn plus the half rate fungicides. Okay, and of course yield is what we're always interested in. Okay, and in terms of the quality aspects, again, a bit more movement here in terms of the 1,000 grain weight between them, but you can see not massive differences and not something we would say was an enormous difference in terms of 1,000 grain weight. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that as the IPM. Some of the take-home messages across all of the trials, a lot of these high yielding varieties, they need careful management for disease. Okay, we've touched on the fact they're a bit weak in terms of the major disease threats. The major disease threats remain the same. In winter barley, it's Rhynchosporium, mildew, okay. On some sites, it was yellow rust. But generally, we're talking about that. And we're also talking about ramularia. Those are the main threats. So again, as we stressed to you, it's knowing your local conditions. It's knowing your susceptibility to these specific diseases and keep an eye on the weather. Okay. In terms of what you have available, we've got prothioconazole, and Proline remains that major component of disease control programs. In terms of Rhynchosporium, which is still our major yield robber, the STHI azole mixtures are good against Rhyncho. There's been a big question mark about fall pit this year, and a lot of people asking, obviously with the loss of CTL, what can we use to replace it as a multi-site? Does fall pit have a role? In previous years, perhaps the results have not been so clear-cut, but what we've seen this year is fall pit may have activity against Rhyncho and ramularia, and I'll say a bit more about that when we get to the spring barley. Okay, so spring barley conditions, again, you're into this dry, warm spring. That didn't favor splash-borne diseases such as Rhynchosporium. What we did see in some of the spring barley crops, or more specifically, anybody growing Propino, I'd be keen to hear about your experience, but what we saw in our trials and the different trial sites is there was a lot of net blotch in the Propino this year. There's a question mark about where that seed came from. We know net blotch is a seed-borne pathogen, and the fact we saw it from site to site, but only in Propino, points towards some seed-borne infection coming in. Okay, what we did see is ramularia coming in to many sites. Okay, so the growing conditions actually favored ramularia much more in the spring barley than they did in the winter barley. Okay, in terms of yield, Predictions are actually the yield will be down slightly in spring barley compared to 2020. Obviously, the growing conditions in 2020 were such a warm seed bed and the crops just raced through. Not quite as good in 2020, so slightly down. And spring barley production predicted to decrease by around about 11%, basically because of that decreased yield. Okay, so it looks down, but if you look back across that and you look at the averages, it's still a pretty good yield for spring barley across Scotland in 2021. Okay, I said Ramularia came in late. I went round 4 of these spring barley recommended list sites around Scotland and scored all of the varieties to see if there's any significant difference. This is from the untreated plots. So this is figures which are the mean of the 4 RL sites. So you've got things, the left-hand side of the graph, you've got things like Diablo, Propino, RGT Planet. That's the best we have at the moment. And you're still talking around about up to 12 to 15% of Ramularia. Compare that to the weaker varieties on the right-hand side. So we put some of these older varieties in because we know they're susceptible just as controls. So you've got Braemar and Chariot there, well over 20%. So again, when you put those error bars in, they're not significant differences, but there's a slight tendency within some varieties to be more susceptible to Ramularia. And because there's no significant differences, this is again why Ramularia scores are not included on the AHGB recommended list at the moment. But we do keep monitoring for anything new that comes onto the list if they are significantly different from the other varieties available. Okay, so one of the projects we've had running, there's been a lot of discussion about what can we use to control Ramularia leaf spot in spring barley. We had CTL. We know CTL was the most effective fungicide at the T2 timing to control Ramularia. So for a couple of years, we've been running some trials funded by Means of Lauriston to actually look at potential options at that T2 timing. Okay, so we lost last 2020 because of COVID. This is the results from 2021. So all of the plots in this trial had a cover spray to control Rinco to give the Ramularia a chance to develop. So this is at Bog Hall. And then you've got a comparison here, your T2 spray. So Revistar from the FP trials is considered the most effective fungicide at T2 timing compared to Proline, a little bit of activity compared to the untreated, but not much. You've got Serenade, so your biologicals, Comet the Strobilurin, we expect to do nothing. There's the surprise, there's Fulpit doing a reasonable job as a T2 timing. Another multi-site, potential multi-site, you've got sulfur, you've got Kayak Saprodinil, Microthiol is another sulfur product, Cyflamid, a mildew-cide. We tried it with no T2 just to see what would happen. And there's Imtrex giving a slight reduction, but not much. The red line, of course, is yield. So there's no surprise. We know Proline is an important part of the crop protection program in terms of controlling all pathogens. So that's giving a yield response. But there's the other surprise. There's Fulpit giving a yield response as well. Also quite interesting, quite a good yield response from Microthiol too. Okay, so fairly variable in terms of yield response. But I guess the big surprise was how well Fulpit had done compared to Revistar. So that was one trial. The other trial, there's been a lot of discussion about the importance of plant health and adding plant nutrition into your program to give you increased disease resistance. So this is the result from the 2021 trial at Perth, where we had a lot of Ramularia symptoms in the crop. Again, a cover spray across all the plots. But here's the difference in either T1 or T2 options. So you've got Omex at the start, this is potassium carbonate, Sulfamex, which is nitrogen and sulfur, Synergy is copper, zinc, and sulfate, Kelpak is a giant brown seaweed, Phytophosphite, or Phytophos is phosphite, DP98 is a fully soluble phosphorus source, copper, as it says, is headland copper, which can be used as a fertilizer or a fungicide. Microthiol is another form of the sulfur that we talked about. So amino flow, that's a liquid natural amino acid product, okay? And we've got it here either as 2 applications at 1 litre or one application at 2.5 litres. Okay, and there's the DP98 just as one spray. So the blue bars are ramularia. So you can see in terms of controlling ramularia, actually it's the copper that seems to give the biggest reduction. You look at the red line, of course, which we're always interested in, is the yield. So there's a response from the Synergy, from the copper as well. But 2.5 litres of amino flow gave a fairly significant increase in yield. So 7.8 compared to the untreated is around about 7. We saw this in 2019 in the same trial. So we were wondering what was the cause of that. There's that significant yield increase. When we looked at some of the quality aspects, so in terms of specific weight, there's the amino, there's your untreated specific weight. So 50, just over 56. If you look across at the amino flow, it's around about the same. So no significant increase in specific weight, which suggests it could possibly be the survival of more tillers and you're producing more grains, but not actually bigger, bolder grains. By contrast, look at the omex there. Look at the increase in specific weight you get from the omex. Okay, so that yield response in amino flow may not be related to bigger, bolder grains. It may just be increased grain site survival. Okay. So we also were looking at the IPM program in spring barley. In this trial, we're either half of the plots had no seed treatment, half of them had laminarin, and here we're playing about with different T knots. Okay, so the kayak we talked about, there's the phytophosphite, Rhizobacter is a biological, laminarin is the elicitor, companion is another biological, inimiso is the elicitor, Sitco SA and chitosan are both elicitors again. And what we've done here, all of these treatments are followed by a T1 and a T2 timing, but those are down to quarter dose rates, okay? So you're looking for a yield response compared to the completely untreated, and your fungicide costs are well down, okay? Looked at 2 varieties. We looked at Laureate, we looked at Propino, giving you results here for Laureate. So what we're interested in here is the disease control. So the blue bars are Rhynchosporium, the orange bars ramularia, fairly low in terms of disease. But if you look at the gray line, this is a yield response. So there's that yield response from an early fungicide with kayak at the T naught, nothing so much from the phyta. The biological is giving you a yield response. 2 shots of, one shot of laminarin didn't seem to do as well in the spring barley as it did in the winter. The biologicals and the other elicitors were not particularly great, okay? This is the results from the sets of plots which had laminarin as a seed treatment, followed by the same T naught treatments. And here you can see you're actually seeing a better yield response with the 2 shots of laminarin this time, the companion and an inimiso, and actually with the Sitco SA and the chitosan, you're actually seeing a better yield response. So double a shot of elicitors in this case seems to be doing a better job, giving you a better yield response. And if you look at the disease levels with the chitosan, they're well down in terms of Rhynchosporium and ramularia. Okay, so conclusions for the spring barley. That's been a variable disease year. As I said, you need to be aware of your local issues. In terms of Rhynchosporium, our major disease, the SDHI azole mixtures are still good. Okay, so we've also got more option this year in the Astra X Pros now come to market. It's a new fungicide product from Bayer. We're probably replacing Siltra X Pro, so it's got a bit more bixafen in there than the Siltra X Pro had. Okay, and you'll see more about the full results for Astra when we do the disease roadshows in January. Okay, you're getting potential control from ramularia, from Revistar, a little activity from Proline, and also from the fall pit. Okay, so more of that to come. Some of our trials work seems to show 2 applications of fall pit seems to be particularly effective, and that echoes results from not just Scotland but also across Europe. Okay, so if you're thinking about fall pit, you might need to think 2 applications to get the best response. In terms of elicitors in the IPM program, we're seeing definitely some potential. They can help reduce the fungicide input. David had that graph, he was showing you the top 25, that table, top 25, middle, and bottom 25. Did you notice the fungicide costs? So if you can reduce or make the most of your fungicide costs, you're hopefully then getting a better margin on the crop that you produce. There's a big question mark about the role of biostimulants and the plant health enhancers. From our trials in terms of ramularia control, we're not seeing significant control from any of them, but we need to see how a lot of these biostimulants and also the elicitors work in lower nitrogen situations. And David's touched on the reasons why we're looking at lower nitrogen situations coming along. Okay, so that's going to be our major focus of research in the next 5 years for the Scottish Government. How do these new potential control measures work in a new area where we're looking at potentially lower inputs? Okay. And lastly, touch on winter wheat. Again, not much rainfall, so there was low septoria pressure, but we did have the conditions which were suitable for yellow rust, not just in the winter barley, but also in the winter wheat. So this is again is another photograph from our Boghall site, and you can see some of these varieties susceptible to yellow rust were absolutely covered in it. Okay, so again, that's going to be an issue going forward. Again, keep checking the weather conditions, check the yellow rust status of the variety you choose, and think about what you might do as an option. Okay, in terms of wheat production for this year, they're expecting a 12% increase in the planted area and a 7% increase in yield. So those growing conditions we've had this year have actually favored the winter wheat. We've had a lot of sunlight, a lot of high temperatures. That's kept the crop going, not such a high disease pressure. So it's probably done much better. And those long summer days have helped boost that yield up. Okay, so the yield's expected to rise to about 9.2 tons per hectare. So that would almost be the second highest yield recorded over the last 20 years. It'd be interesting to see if what your experience is that if you think you're seeing nearly record returns similar to that. Okay, the take-home message, I touched on the importance of that yellow rust control. Obviously, we've lost epoxyconazole in the last year as well. So you might have to think about a different option for a T-knot. In terms of what you might think about Proline and Imtrex have good activity against yellow rust, and they're probably your cheapest option going for a straight product. Okay. The more mixed products that you would consider for septoria control at T1 and especially the T2 timing, we need to trying to protect the upper canopy. The full mixed products containing SDHI, azoles are showing very good efficacy, and you'll see more about that in the January roadshows. So that's good to know. There are two products which are specifically good on septoria, so that's Revistar, the methyltrifluconazole, and Univoc, which is the QII fungicide from Corteva. So you've got good options there. We always knew Fulpit was a better option for winter wheat than it was for barley. So Fulpit and sulfur are possible CTL replacements in wheat programs. And again, that'll be something to think about when you're planning your program for next year. Okay, so just like to thank the main RESAS and Means of Lauriston for funding in the trials shown today. Thank the trials team, the technical staff, Carbon Crop and Soil Group, and thanks for listening, and hope to answer any questions you might have.
Okay then, Neil, that seemed pretty thorough. Are you sure you've got more for the roadshows in January? That seems.
There's plenty more where that came from, Ewan. That's just a flavour of it. Trust me, you haven't got the FP curves to come yet.
Oh well. Well, we seem to have a good number of questions coming in, so we've obviously stimulated a bit of debate. So it's good to see, and yeah, just that Q&A box at the bottom, just click it in and start typing in your questions and that. We've got one for Steve for a start, asking, it would be nice to see 2 grades of fungicide inputs, varieties which have good inherent resistance from a full fungicide program to one that is maybe half the price. Steve, are you aware of anything that's happening there?
Yeah, it's a topic that has been under discussion for some time, and we've even had discussion over the years with AHGB at having, say, some kind of intermediate program that reflected more of the growing conditions, whereas the treated tends to be a kind of a Rolls-Royce treatment, and it's not realistic of the way we grow the crop. So it's really about potential in the fully treated, and then of course the untreated is the other extreme. So yeah, the idea of having something in between. We've done this before in some projects, but it tends to be very short term, and we've not had a sustained development. But when I was thinking of how we might use other data when we're putting variety information together, I think there's probably scope for pulling together data that comes from different trials, different companies, and sort of public and private trials, so we can begin to address Jackie's question there. I think we can begin to do that.
Okay.
Can I make a comment, Ewan?
Yeah, by all
Because
means.
I sit on the barley, oats and other cereals recommended committee, and as Steve said, it's a hot topic of discussion. That a lot of the breeders, they quite like having that untreated and then that full fungicide program, because they like to show the potential of the variety at the full potential. But of course, there's a good argument that the trials protocol, as Steve said, doesn't reflect commercial practice. So it's still a topic of discussion, but we try, and in our trials we try and put something in which is a bit more realistic. So what we would call a full fungicide program would be half rates of fungicide for a starting point.
Okay. Well, I hope that answers Jackie's question. There was a query again on varieties, Steve. Is there a replacement for KW Lily, the Group 2 milling wheat, as it seems to do well on light soils?
Yeah, I saw that question from Scott. Yeah, so it's an interesting one, and with that group, if Scott was interested in that group in particular, then the choices are more narrow. But certainly the varieties that would be most similar would be, in terms of performance, would be perhaps Sextays and the new Palladium. But I would have some concern about, I need to chat with Scott about this, that if he had issues with seed set, then Xdays is a higher risk choice. But that would be a possible if he was not worried about seed set. Otherwise, outside of that group, then I noted that Skyscraper or Swallow as a soft feed, or Inciter as a hard feed look relatively good in that part of the rotation. But Scott can get in touch. We can take that forward if he wants.
Okay, no, that's good. Moving on to the next question. One more about nitrogen. Is variable rate nitrogen cost effective? Should good land get more or poor land get more? Is it effective all season or on certain applications? David.
Okay, thanks, David, for that question. Variable, I didn't really touch on technology actually tonight, but yeah, variable rate's a good way of making sure the crop is getting the correct amount of nitrogen at the right time of year. So in my book, what you're trying to do is at the start, the poor land should get more at the start of the season to try and even it up. But as you go through the season, if the crop is not catching up, then your kind of last application is where you would be reducing that back. So it does depend on, I'm speaking winter crops here, if you're on winter wheat, then if there's a poor bit, you'd be trying to feed that to start with, see if you can even it up. If it doesn't even up, then don't feed it so much later on. So that's kind of, yeah, I think that kind of maybe answers your questions. Whether it's cost effective, trying to get the nitrogen onto the right part of the field at the right time has got to be a good thing. And what you tend to find is that the overall amount of nitrogen isn't reduced, but it's certainly going in the right places to do the right job.
Okay, no, that seems a good one. David, I think here's another question for you. Looking to putting on FYM onto some green manure in May 2022, but would this benefit crops in the 2023 harvest?
I thank Scott. That the answer is it will. How to quantify it's quite difficult, in that you've applied that muck onto the crop. It'll have fed the green manure, which is then utilising that nutrients, and then as you destroy it and put that crop back into the ground, it will release it back to the next crop. But it will depend on what is in the mix and what kind of stage it's at when you destroy it, if it's woody or if it's still green, and how you incorporate it, and then how the soil reacts to it. So if it's quite woody and there's a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, then the soil will need a bit, or the bugs in the soil, sorry, will need a bit of nitrogen to break it down. If it's still green when you incorporate it, that will be less so, and there's probably going to be more available for the following crop in the winter.
Okay, thank you. Another one, Neil. Have you got any results from Syngenta's new fungicide called Adipidin? Adipidin.
We've had Adipidin in trial. Adipidin's been used as a coded product in AHGB trials, so we can't say anything about it because it hasn't completed the registration process yet, but it looks to be quite an interesting product.
That sounds like code language, Neil.
That's an interesting product. I'm not allowed to say any more than that, unfortunately, Ewan.
No. Oh, well, everyone that's listening, take note. Look for the trial data to see what it does.
Yeah.
And then another wee question, I think back to David. Is there a simple method to work out what the residual N I'm holding in my cover crops that could be available for spring barley? You maybe can answer that a wee bit with the green manure question earlier, maybe, did you?
Yeah, thanks, George, for that. The answer is there isn't really an easy way to calculate it. Like I said, with Scott's question, it depends on when you destroy it and the stage it's at. We are actually doing some work on this at the moment with another group I'm involved with in the soil regen group. We're looking at this for this winter, so we'll hopefully have a better idea come the springtime as to what sort of residuals there is being carried forward. So yeah, we're working on it.
Okay. Neil, I think this maybe need to be our last question. Great results from the 2x full pit, but being a multi-site, is it at risk of getting lost with being withdrawn?
Yes, they're all at risk. I mean, obviously, with Mancozeb going shortly after CTL, there's a question mark about the long-term survivability of full pit, but there's sulfur in there we're looking at as well, so there's no real threat for that as far as I know. One of the challenges we're going to have is people mention new products and new things coming to market. You've got, for example, the Univoc, the QII, how do we manage that for an anti-resistance strategy? Because you need to protect single site fungicides. If you've got one mode of action and you haven't got an equally strong partner, you're putting a selection pressure on the pathogen. So if you don't have a multi-site or you don't have an equally strong product partner, you're basically running the risk that this selection pressure will eventually lead to a mutation. And we're all fed up hearing about mutations at the moment, but a mutation in the plant pathogen, which will end up spreading, will end up with resistance becoming an issue. So yeah, if we don't have multi-sites, how do we manage the single sites that we have and prolong their use? So it's going to be a challenge. We may have to go back. The inorganics multi-sites, as I mentioned, the sulfur. There's a lot of interest in sulfur now.
Okay, right. Well, this is just 9 o'clock. So I said the meeting was going to run from 7:30 till 9 o'clock, and we're just bang on the button there. So just as a wee ending, you mentioned the AHGB roadshows in January. Do you want to say the dates, Neil?
So sure. So we're going in reverse order this time. We're starting up at Thainston House Hotel in Inverurie, which is Tuesday, the 18th of January, 10 o'clock till 3 p.m. And then we're heading south. So Thursday, the 20th, it's at Carfrey Mill Lodge near Lauder. And that's again 10 o'clock till 3 p.m. Because we're having to reduce the number of physical events, we would have done one in Perth, we would have done one in Inverness. There'll be an online event on the 26th of January, but I don't have the time for that yet at the moment.
Okay, oh, well, look out for them and that. So just before I finish, I would like to highlight that this is part of the Farm Advisory Service. So the funding has been given through the Scottish Government, so need to thank them. Our technical guy behind the scenes tonight has been Malcolm McDonald, so I'd like to thank him as well. And if I can get everyone to show their appreciation for our speakers tonight, Steve, David, and Neil, a great big thank you from me, and I'm sure everyone that's been watching, thank you for your presentations tonight. Thank you.
Thank you,
Ewan. So yes, as Neil said, watch out for the meetings in January, and as Steve said, look out for the recommended list coming out next week. Okay, hopefully we can just finish this webinar now, just in time for everyone to watch I'm a Celebrity.
There's
okay,
a hand
good evening.
Right.
Oh, sorry.
There's a hand
Neil.
up from David Buchanan, but I don't know if that's a clap or he's just got his hand up.
All right. I think that's maybe just a clap. I think maybe.
We don't have a clapping emoji.
Yep. Oh, well. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Okay.
Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Night,
logging
everyone.
in.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye. Thanks.